The Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 14, A Brush with the Enemy. Later that day, we left the church and trudged back to the main road. Bedraggled, full of thoughts about the road we'd travelled and the path my life had taken, I tried in vain to pay attention to the chatter of my girls. They talked all the time, sharing their impressions of the bright green world that was so unfamiliar to them as they skipped by the cart. When I tried, I half heard what they said, but our journey was taking its toll. Years of worry, flashbacks to the night the pirates had attacked our boat, the slow decay of my marriage, all wore heavily on me. For her part, Helen remained distant, doing her best to forage along our route. All I could think of was some relief from this relentless spiral. My heart was as heavy as my footsteps. We were carried eventually to Fontmell by our tired and aching limbs. From the high road to the east, we looked down on the town below, wondering what might lay there for us. From our vantage point, we could see the fields all around. They were roughly turned over and weed-strewn. No crops could have grown here for a year at least, I said, addressing my crouching family as we spied from our vantage point. Few trees grew on the hill we watched from, save for some chestnuts and hollies. Nor did any beast roam within range of my binoculars. What lack of imagination could lead to all livestock being killed, such that so far, even though we were travelling across country, we hadn't seen a single farm animal anywhere. Doubtless the beasts of burden that once must have been kept here would have provided short-term relief from starvation. Without them, cultivation had evidently become impossibly laborious to effect on any adequate scale. It was typical of mankind to act in its immediate interest rather than with a long-term view in mind. It was exactly the weakness that had led to the end of oil and our inability to adjust in time to prevent the collapse. No human moved down there either. The lack of cars abandoned in the streets suggested the population had fled the place, but my gut told me some remained hidden, perhaps preferring to scratch out a living here in fear of being dispossessed, or perhaps grouping together for tribal security. It spelled danger for us either way, lacking as we did any ties with them. Judging by our greeting at the cove, we would be seen as a threat to what remained in this community. Despite the danger, more immediate needs pressed on us, as always. I think we need to see what we can find down there, I said to my wife. We'll wait for you here, don't be long, she replied calmly, as if I were a stranger. She understood, as well as I, the need to take every opportunity to replenish our supplies, and that we needed each other to get our children back to safety. She raised her hand to her brow and scanned below, perhaps the better not to meet my gaze. Michael, I said, turning to him, we'll go together. Bring an empty sack with you. Kids, stay with Mum and don't make too much noise, okay? I handed Helen the binoculars from my belt. Settling on a large tree stump, she rested her bow on her lap, leaning her quiver of hunting arrows against her thigh. The children began to hunt for horse chestnuts amid the debris on the floor. It would occupy them for hours if need be. A low hedge would conceal their movement. Watched by Helen, we dropped downhill, following the hedge line, skulking cautiously into town. There was eerie silence. Many doors were daubed with warnings. They're all barricaded by the looks of it, said Michael. He scanned the windows around us warily. An arrow notched. Indeed, many of the homes appeared fortified, but we managed to find 2 abandoned houses whose doors were wide open. We worked quickly, levering up some remnants of the parquet floor in one and stuffing the small slabs into our coats. We began to search for food and water. Before long, though, we had a bad feeling about being in the town. It was as if we were being watched. We shared a knowing look, and delaying no longer, hustled back up the hill, relieved to return to the girls unscathed, though poorly rewarded for the risk we had taken. Reunited, we set off once more. A few miles further north, we made camp on the shore of a reservoir nestled in the hills, burning our smokeless plunder in the evening light and tucking into a haul of blackberries we had gathered on the way. It was a beautiful spot, as peaceful as any on this earth. I was glad to have this opportunity to spend time with my family, still safe and well separated from the threats of the wider world around us. But as day departed and the moon shone bright, I felt restless, urged by my empty stomach and desperate for distraction from the torment in my head. Without much ceremony, I set out in the hope that I might bring back some meat to roast on the fire. It seemed so natural to go hunting for food, the genes of ancestors reverberating in my bones. The ancients, it seemed, had significantly larger herds of prey animals to hunt and infinitely more knowledge than I could dream of having. My dream of early success and a belly full of red meat for each of us gave way to a harsher reality. After crossing a long stretch of abandoned road that separated our camp from open countryside, I strode further and further out in search of elusive prey. Nothing but owls seemed in abundance. I did not have the skill to shoot them, and after hours of wandering the lonely expanses of sapling forest and scrub, searching in vain, I began to head back to camp dejected. I was disappointed and empty-handed. I had broken a cardinal rule of survival. I had been inefficient with my energy, suffering the deficit now. Dishevelled and weary, I eventually found the road again, my crossing fortunate in its timing, for if I'd arrived a second later, it might have been the end of me. Pausing in the darkness, shocked at first but then curious, I heard a vehicle engine a long way off coming towards my position. The engine gunned hard, and the glow of headlights glided with unnatural pace beyond a spur in the north. From the rate of increase in noise, I judged it would be on me in moments. Taking no chances, I retreated a metre or so behind the tree line of the spinney to my side. The moon, a cool lamp in the cloudless sky, lit the grassy verge before me. Crouching down in the low scrub, I notched an arrow and rested my finger on the shaft to hold it in place. My free hand patted the grip of my pistol. The vehicle grew closer, approaching from my right. It was confidently driven, for it did not pick its way over the highway, slicked with leaf mould, but maintained a steady pace. It was the noisiest thing I had heard since the barge, which seemed like a lifetime ago already, and hearing it now transported me back in time. Soon the vehicle came into view and made its way along the long curve in the road. I feared I may be spotted. The headlights began to illuminate my position in a mass of tangled light and rushing shadows. For a moment the engine reduced its revving. Damn, had they seen me? Humans are clever hunters, and it is hard to simply hide from such a sophisticated predator. Why hadn't I moved further back? My muscles tensed, fighting an overwhelming urge to jump and run for lack of confidence in my hiding place. I breathed as evenly as I could to fight the urge, but my pulse quickened nonetheless. I held my breath. As it drew closer, I could tell from the ride height and width that it was a light off-road vehicle. Perhaps it was military, but in the dazzling lights I could not make out its features. As it reached the road right ahead of me, I heard a rustle to my side, and, keeping my head as still as possible, rolled my eyes in its direction to spy the cause of this unexpected new sound in the darkness. To my shock, my gaze was met by a muntjac, its dark, bulging eyes picked out momentarily by the sweeping beam of the headlights. Surprised by my unexpected presence as close as I was, and startled further by the noise of the vehicle, the deer launched itself out into the long grass beyond the tree line. It was making for the safety of the darkness in the woods across the old road. Its timing could not have been worse. A thump sounded as it was intercepted at the curb, the vehicle striking its shoulder and launching its body back onto the overgrown verge from which it had appeared. Almost before it landed, the fate of the hapless beast had triggered the opportunist in me. I began to uncoil my taut limbs, but the vehicle, which by now was some 50 yards to my left and beyond where it struck the deer, slowed suddenly. A squeal of warm brakes split the night air, sending a flock of roosting birds to flight in their alarm, framed by the moon as they soared out towards the safety of the placid reservoir a mile distant. Practically committed already, in a snap decision I released my bowstring and, keeping as low as I could, bolted from the safety of the undergrowth. Heart pounding, I rushed as fast as I could to where I judged the wounded beast to lie, reaching the spot just as the vehicle doors opened with a rusty snap of grinding metal hinges. Two low voices spoke to someone unseen in the rear of the vehicle, men within 50 yards of me. Beginning to regret the folly of my choice, I scanned the ground in desperation, and at the very moment that my eyes settled on the expired creature's hide, my dappled form was picked out in the beam of a powerful lamp. A shout went up as the men, trained as doubtless they were, nevertheless reacted with surprise to the crouching form of a fellow human. There was a pregnant pause, then one swore and shouted at me to stop. In panic, I had grabbed my prize by its broken forelegs and pelted at full gait to the edge of the spinney. By the time the first shot shattered the air above my head, my heart pounding and the deer lolling lifelessly in my arms, I picked my way as fast as I could amongst the dark snares of spindly trees. The vast majority of this forest consisted of saplings and standing deadwood, and it was on one such natural snag that I caught the razor head of my notched arrow. Being stopped dead by the impact, the arrow was wrenched from my coveting hand, twisting back my index finger and jabbing me in the ribs as it tore away from the bow. I gasped in pain but did not stop, walking in panic straight into a branch that seemed to whip my eyeball clean out of my head. I yelped in pain and immediately hampered by a flood of tears. Fighting on, I broke past it to continue my flight deeper into the thickening tangle. As I ran, another shot rang out. Although I was half expecting it, the sound of a round splintering the branches spurred me to move ever faster. The deer was light under my arm as adrenaline coursed through my body. My mind began to function on a heightened level, such that I could steer the leading tip of my bow through the many obstacles before me, even as I bounded, each foot deftly placed between treacherous traps of deadwood at my feet as my eyesight was recovered. Soon the spinney broke into an open meadow of long grass spreading up a gentle incline that concluded in a thinned out woodland above. Hundreds of stumps littered the site, but there was no substantial cover up there. I would be running uphill with scant place to hide and guns at my back. To make the best of the cover there was, I skirted the field to my left instead of bolting across it, all the time keeping my head instinctively low to avoid the next shot. Fear urged me on. I was exposed by my pursuers, and my pursuers must surely reach the field before I could leave it. A shot came as I reached the summit of the meadow, and was trying to determine my best route up the hill through the tangled debris and away from my pursuers. This time the bullet passed by my shoulder, barely missing me. They were determined, and they were starting to get a bead on my camouflaged form. I dropped instantly to the ground, instinctively checked the butt of my pistol to see if it was still in place after my hectic flight, and prayed they did not have working night vision with them. "I think I got him!" exclaimed a voice below me. Silence fell upon the wide, overgrown field. There was not a sound from nocturnal creatures now. All lay low as I, waiting in the tall grass. I raised my head millimetrically, rising from the grass to spy them, as slowly as a weed may grow from the ground. Torchlights were fanning out as they crossed the field, one heading directly for my position. Without cover on the higher ground and facing trained and armed men determined to retrieve their quarry, I realized that drastic action was required. Praying my bow was not damaged, I notched a hunting arrow, drew back, and altered my angles for the breeze, slope, and distance. I shook with exertion as I held it drawn, and finally released the string as my target was picked out in the beam of the middle pursuer's own torchlight. Before the beam could turn towards my distinctive sound, the arrow met its mark. With a grunt of shock, the man at the furthest flank from me was felled. His scream followed a gaping silence. It pierced the darkness, drawing the torchlights towards it. A burst of wild suppressing shots diced the air in reply, but my mind was humming like the bowstring as a revelation struck me like an arrow. When I was young, I could throw a knife into a tree trunk from 10 feet away. I would sleep in a foxhole in our garden and cook on a campfire. I would run so fast, so it seemed to me, that the air would rush past my ears. If my brothers attacked me, I could fight back with the abounding aggression that sibling rivalry demands. I was satisfied with everything I ate, everything I watched on TV, everything I experienced. Then adulthood happened, and despite my best efforts at breaking the mold to forge a path less ordinary, for many years I lived cooped up in a domestic and career-shaped magnolia cell. I felt like a caged tiger then, punching numbers and telling people that what they wanted to hear. I seemed never destined to realise my full potential or to be satisfied, closeted instead by the liberal fascism of a political correctness and the mountain of administrative paperwork that life and responsibility in society foisted on me. The end to all that came with the end of oil, an apocalypse to some, a wonder of nature, and an opportunity to others. In this moment, feeling more alive than ever before, my nature, at last, was free and clear. All was in the balance. My pursuers were testing me. I was discovering whether my self-image had any basis in reality, for I knew from experience how thinking of oneself as capable and dangerous, an alpha male, could easily be proved naive when tested. But now all my reactions, my awareness, the alert machine of my body, and the processing of what I saw seemed off the scale as I faced this deadly threat. I was without the advantage of surprise, but I felt a wave of confidence wash over me. It was not over yet. I knew that, but still, while still fear played its part, I never wondered how I would fare in this test. A strange, deep feeling of manhood had accompanied the thud of that arrow, and even in this crazy situation, with the lives of my family at stake, it was a rush to face death, to pit my strength and skill against them, to have a meaningful challenge for which mankind is designed. My choice had been simple, to divert them away from me by using their belief that I would have attacked the nearest quarry. The uninjured men dropped to cover, but such was their brotherhood they could not simply lie in the darkness listening to their fallen comrade gurgling in pain. They switched off their torches but could be heard crawling to his aid. This was my chance to take flight again, and with a deep inhalation I leapt up, darting up the hill almost amongst the saplings, zigzagging to present the hardest possible target. Within 20 metres I reached an old dirt path which had been cut perpendicular to the steepening incline, and thus afforded some physical cover from further shots. I ran as hard as my burning lungs and pounding heart would allow me, rising up to near the summit of the hill before skirting round it to avoid presenting a silhouette in the moonlit night. All this while I had been moving further and further away from my waiting family. By the time I reached the second summit since that dark skirmish, I was unable to run any further and crouched in some thick gorse to catch my breath. Breathing hard, I took stock of my situation and scanned the valley below me for any signs of movement from my pursuers. All was still and calm. I held my breath to listen, and within a few moments heard the distant sound of a vehicle engine firing into life. Fearful of a trap, I spent what seemed an age in that spot, scanning, tuning into the night, moving as slowly as I could to avoid attracting a hunter's gaze. My ghillie suit swayed and shimmered like willow tendrils in the light breeze. Resisting the urge to field dress the deer to make for a lighter load, the guts would attract scavengers who would give away a position from which to track me. I hefted its carcass onto my shoulder, slipped back down the hill by a circuitous route, and crossed the valley once more. By following the natural breaks in the undergrowth, I found my way back to the roadside about half a mile north from where I had first encountered the vehicle. Crossing with caution, I took great care to avoid leaving obvious footprints in the patches of mud that dotted the hidden tarmac. On the other side, I made long leaps across the grass to minimize my trail, taking wild tangents in a dozen directions to throw off a tracker. Further north, still bearing the now very heavy prize, I entered a dark copse set by shimmering moonlit water. Again I settled down to watch, for long minutes, the arc of roots to my position. Now I was close to my family and could not risk being followed. Eventually, I lay down on my belly and, dragging the deer with me, reversed into this thick undergrowth. Suddenly, my exposed ankle was grasped with a light touch. It steered me around the crouching form of my son. Stock still and also in camouflage, he waited until I had retreated past him before resuming his vigil. Awesome, he exclaimed excitedly when he spotted the deer. Teenagers' stomachs make many of their value judgments. Did you hear the shots? I asked him, pursing my lips as I thought of the cost of this prize. He furrowed his brow quizzically. That night, by the moonlight, I dressed and skinned the deer, butchered it, and packaged what I could in layers of table salt and greaseproof paper we'd scavenged from one of the houses in Fontmell. What we couldn't package up was to be draped on hot rocks by the fire to cook, but we could not risk lighting one yet. We needed to be well away from here first. Cautiously, I crept into the open to wash my knife and hands on the lake shore before the sticky blood could contaminate everything. The water lapped gently, the serenity of my actions belied by the maelstrom in my head. By now I was exhausted, the fatigue of the pursuit finally overcoming the fog of adrenaline. Yawning widely, I knelt by the entrance to the low olive-green shelter where my children had slept soundly beneath the stars, their faces glowing in the cloudless night, nestled in a menagerie of sleeping bags, bivvy bags and blankets. On a pillow of woolen jumpers that had been wrapped in a clean white silk pillowcase rested the head of my youngest. Her hair glowed like platinum in the ambient light, rosebud lips perked and perfect, her breathing steady and low. She lay huddled between her older siblings, the centre of our universe. In the tight confines of the shelter, their chests expanded and contracted, jostling for position, distorting each other as universes and all things in them do in their own temporal dimensions. Their moment, their light, would be eternal, just as our love for them. Helen eyed the deer meat and smiled. That was lucky, she said. I didn't tell her what had happened by the road. I just reminded them to stay alert on watch. At this instruction, unwanted as always, Helen retreated once more inside herself. She did not know they might come looking for us. At first light, a long way back from us, towards the spinney, I heard a convoy of vehicles arrived where we had clashed the night before. A dog barked, and then there was no more sound. Perhaps they would track uphill at first, but it wouldn't take long to find their way back round towards us. We spent an hour laying low, eating what we could of the meat cooked on hexamin blocks. Replenished, we waited despite the manhunt taking place, not risking lighting a fire. And by now, the children knew it was dangerous to move or make a noise when other humans were about, especially those well armed and motivated to protect what they saw as theirs. Even the baby, unable to completely contain her enthusiasm and energy, would whisper to her siblings, making humorous observations, unable to stifle fits of giggles at her own jokes, giggles that were infectious and intoxicating. Still we lay low. As the warm sun traced a steady curve high above us, we listened to the sweet cry of ospreys calling. Later that day, convinced our pursuers were well into the forest, on the wrong bearing and beyond sight of us from the higher ground, we slipped away. My son took point, leading the rest on a 340 bearing through the undulating countryside. Following at some distance, I covered our tracks as best I could, looking back often to check we weren't being followed. After an hour, we came across an embankment that hid an abandoned quarry. Walking in our stealthy pattern, my son, who climbed it to get the lay of the land ahead, suddenly froze. He gave the hand signal for us to stop, keeping his hand low as he crouched. Each of us dropped instantly. The youngest, who was walking with her sister to stretch her legs, nestled close to her, instinctively following her example by staying still and silent. Clicks came to me across the radio. 3 clicks meant people. 3 pairs indicated 3 had been seen.
A final set, clicking in the rhythm of a football chant, called me forward. Notching an arrow, now sweating and breathing hard, I left my girls and moved up. As I reached my son, I stayed stooped low, my bow level before me. Moving like a cat preparing to pounce, I chose my footing carefully, avoiding twigs, making sure to avoid the mud too. All the while, my apparent error played on my mind. Had we escaped from the frying pan into the fire? Beyond the long grass, I observed the carved-out bowl of the quarry stretched out before us. Within its stark contours, two men were setting small nets over the entrances to a rabbit warren. Weapons were propped on rocks near to each man. As they worked, fully focused on their task, one shouted, and a black dog, which had been hidden round a bend in the quarry road, came trotting towards him obediently. It was the first land mammal that I had seen since our trip down the river on the Ark. The third stranger turned so that I could see he held in his hands two white-tan ferrets. The dog sniffed at them with interest. The wind carried their distinctive scent to my nostrils, breaking through even the waxy stench of my camouflage paint. It carried too snippets of their conversation. The bandit shot him in the chest. They are scared to pull it out. Poor bastard probably won't make it, reported the one nearest to us. His West Country accent jarred. Well, if the boss hadn't shot the doc on that raid, maybe we'd have someone to help. Birth control, muttered the filthy comrade at the hole off to the right. Well, it's karma, isn't it? Came the riposte. You rape and shoot a woman, and she turns out to be the only person for miles around that can save your right-hand man. Aye, and now he's suffering a horrible death. But we'll get the bastard one way or other. They're out for him now. He must still be in our territory. That's exactly what I'm worried about. We ain't the only ones ready to kill. Well, the boss might have messed up with that bitch that he's right, but he's right on one thing. If we see that bastard, we're to shoot on sight. A chill ran through me. They clearly viewed me as the threat, unable to see the events from my perspective. We evidently faced great peril if we were caught, so we must put distance between us and them. Our stealth had worked so far. They gave no sign of knowing the offender was so close at hand. I did not want to push our luck further. Without a sound, I signalled to my son to retreat. As slowly as he might defuse a bomb, Michael crawled back down to the low, muddy track where the girls waited, and signalled to them. Still in silence, all quizzical looks and palms upwards in inquiry, they set off. Scowls and gesticulations were enough to rain-check the explanations, and they hustled to get moving. The cart was far from quiet as it trundled forward. My wife and son teamed up to roll it away. I winced as the tin bath clattered against the axles, the cart jolting on the rutted track. As they withdrew, the girls trotted along on the far side from me, heads bobbing, ducking instinctively. Falling back slightly, I knelt up, pistol drawn, to scan the summit of the ridge beyond which the quarry and the danger lay, covering our rear as my family disappeared up the road. It seemed rabbits were more interesting to the dog than a strange noise coming from us. After 10 minutes of intense unease and concentration, and without reaction from the preoccupied men, I turned and made my way stealthily downhill to the track. Turning to look behind me as I went, I put some distance between myself and them, hoping they would not crest the embankment or flank me, careful to avoid the mud along the route as I departed. My family has left sign everywhere, but it could not be helped. Where the grass on the verge was flattened by the wheels of the cart, I used the tip of an arrow to ruffle it back up, hoping to make the tracks less obvious. Broken stems could not be helped. Despite the delays, I quickly caught up with my clan, bogged down as they were by our possessions, and hustled them through a gap in a hedge to walk in the field parallel to the track. The turn, I hoped, would suggest we'd headed off on a tangent, throwing off anyone that might pursue us. The dog was a huge concern, though. There was no hiding from them once they were interested. Compelled by the danger, I ushered my kin relentlessly, and we walked long into the night, traversing what seemed an endless parade of fields. Though at first caught up in the moment, Helen, tired and not sharing my concern as the danger seemed to dissipate, began to complain and to question what we were doing. "Not everyone is a threat," she said, looking at me as if I had lost the plot. "When they came after you, perhaps they were just frightened." "You always assume the best in people," I argued back, "even if all the evidence tells you any normal person that they're dangerous. They were fucking shooting at me, for fuck's sake." "Maybe, but you were the man alone, dressed like a soldier. They must have families. What makes you think they would treat a woman with children that way? They would understand what you did. They could even be friends if you just stopped for a minute and tried to speak to them. Not all people are bad." "You are fucking crazy. Keep your voice down," I spat, gritting my teeth in frustration. Helen took offence at this. "No husband would ever speak to the woman he loves like that," she pouted and turned away. "How can I love you? How can I love you when all you do is pull in the other direction? You fight me every step, even though I've kept you alive all this time. What the fuck do you want from me?" I hissed, not nearly quietly enough to prevent my children overhearing. A terrible guilt accompanied my realization that tears were welling in Rose's eyes. My tone had changed from anger to heartbroken self-pity. It was no good. I'd lost the argument now, and Helen's hurt silence was no surprise at all as Rose embraced her. I was alone in company again, my only companion, regret. Our pace slowed to a defeated trudge as Helen switched from flight to searching for somewhere to rest. At last I capitulated, and in the early hours we finally made camp in a small copse that had been untouched by the ravages of man. Apple trees laden with fruit were dotted amongst the thickets of brambles, and a small clearing in the centre made a perfect place to camp. Exhausted, my girls slept curled up under the tarpaulin in the cart, the rest where we fell. I took first watch, noting that Michael had stepped up to his new responsibilities with amazing attention to detail, slept with one hand jutting from his sleeping bag, resting on the shaft of his bow. An arrow jutted up from the log into which the very tip of the razor-sharp head was pressed, ready to be notched with a moment's notice. Unable to stay awake a moment longer, with my ears ringing at fever pitch and my stomach turning with fatigue, I was relieved by my wife, who braved the cold night air to take my place in the hollow overlooking the track. Beyond tired, I crashed into a fitful sleep, dreaming of pursuit, destruction, and emptiness. I was awoken abruptly by something hard hitting my head. As I came to, a short and heavy twig landed in the grass right next to me. A second stick struck me as I lay dazed, and this time I could see the direction it came from. My son, holding his bow with an arrow notched ready to draw, raised his free hand and with wild eyes flashed one finger, indicating across the clearing. Helen was awake too, and lay on her belly in our swag, paralysed momentarily by the rude awakening. It was sudden, the dawning on us that grave danger was approaching. Undisturbed, my eldest daughter murmured in her sleep, while her sister was silent. With heart racing and mind swimming, I reached out my hand for my harness and drew it painfully slowly towards me. Holstered there was the G19, its cold handles slightly damp with the dew. Not daring to wait, I leopard crawled through the dirt, twigs, and sharp stones, trying to reach the perimeter of the clearing in the direction my son had indicated, a place where I might find more tactical cover and a position from which to mount a defence against the unseen enemy. My son had disappeared entirely from view behind me, safe as I covered the arc before me, past the sights of my pistol. Helen had also crawled low, making it to our children and waking them with a hand over their mouths and eyes to match my son's. The expression on her face was enough to give them the message, "Don't make a sound." Tears ran down alarmed faces as she ushered them towards the adjacent tree line, carrying our baby in her arms as she shuffled on her knees, dressed only in her lightweight dry kit and untied boots. Before they moved, Helen unplugged the pipe she carried and reached into a pouch for darts. Rose followed suit, They headed at a tangent to the direction of the approaching foe, but as they reached the clearing edge, they froze in terror. Training my gun ahead of me, I could suddenly see in my peripheral vision the entry into the scene of a stranger. My heart sank as he signaled them to stop and knelt at the edge of the clearing, covering them with his gun. I fought a wave of stunned emotions. My mind was racing. Do I move and give away my position to neutralize the threat he posed, or wait to see the scenario play out? If I acted now, I risked my whole family being wounded in the crossfire. I didn't yet know how many there were or which other direction they would come from, but I recognized the clothes of one I could see. It was one of the hunters. I decided to ease around to get a better bead on this most obvious target, but before I could move a muscle, a threat emitted from behind me, in the thickest part of the undergrowth. It was delivered with a jarring accent. "You move, you fucking die." At that moment, a black dog bounded into the clearing from the front where I and my son had been staring. It sniffed about excitedly at my feet, confirming that it was I to whom the instruction was given. Engaged in its search, the animal headed into the camp to sniff around the fireplace and then trotted over to my family. It was seeking signs of food, and it barked as it approached my wife. Eve shifted her position to put her mother between her and the dog. I scared, she announced in her tiny voice, opening up her arms to reach her mother's embrace and burying her face. A sick feeling rose in my throat. "Throw the weapon into the camp and kneel down. Put your hands on your head and don't say anything, or we'll kill them all." The order was barked by the man at the rear. He was determined. Stunned by my mind, mired as if in treacle, I did as instructed. I could not catch the eye of my wife or children, for they stood motionless and silent 10 yards to my side, facing away. Soon a light rustle of leaves underfoot could be heard ahead of me, the source as yet hidden by the trees. The dog ran back past me and joined this new player as he approached from the front, carrying a revolver with its muzzle aimed at my torso for a sure kill. "Bring your hands behind your back." As soon as I lay down, a heavy knee thudded hard into me, followed by a loop of thick cable tie passing over my right wrist. My face was pressed deeply into the leaf litter and wet grass so that I could see nothing. "What are you doing? Just shoot him," came a voice. "And if I do," answered my assailant shrewdly, "do you think she'll be as accommodating? As long as he's alive, she'll be more willing. Use your head." I heard Helen gasp and stifle a sob. The frightened moans of my children, shocked by her sudden fear rather than anything of what had been said, cut through the electric atmosphere before she embraced them protectively. I growled in anger, but could do nothing, feeling the second loop of cable tie brush my left wrist so as to seal my fate. But the tightening never came. Instead, the stunned silence was broken by a heavy thwack as an arrow, its vicious head smeared with the tincture of purple foxglove, sailing just inches above my shoulder to hit its mark. With deadly intent, it thudded into the man ahead of me, dropping him like a stone. The knee in my back twisted painfully as my captor turned to engage my son, but another arrow rushed in, spinning him into a screaming heap by my side. In a split second, I leapt on him, oblivious to the shot that ripped through the air in my direction. Clamping onto my assailant's back, I acted on impulse, driving my arms past his throat to catch his collar with my wrist under his chin. My other hand whipped under his armpit and drove up behind his neck to apply a fearsome strangle that I had practiced many times in the past. Back then, it had been for fun. Now it was a matter of life and death. I pressed down onto him, hooking my booted feet between his thighs to secure my position, breaking the embedded arrow off, leaving the head to carve up the muscle within his leg. His arm, stretched out above him, flailed wildly, then bent to aim his own pistol at my head. The other he used in vain to try to break my vice-like grip. Fighting hard, for he was insanely strong and burning through my depleted energy reserves, He rolled to his side, his weight driving my hip down on a hard rock beneath me. I yelped in pain but held on. Weakened by lactic acid, I drove the side of my head against his flailing arm, pinning it so that the barrel of his gun aimed past my ear into clear air. A deafening volley of shots was loosed as he tried to gain the upper hand, bullets mercifully headed away from my prostrate girls. As the pressure on his neck took effect, his arm finally grew limp and the weapon flopped to the ground. I clung on for all I was worth as he snorted. Then his toes began to cut furrows in the mud as he fought the strangulation in my arms, clutching me at first and digging his nails into flesh, convulsing at last. The dog, which had come to his aid, growled deeply, unable to pass its master to bite me as the assailant passed. Distracted by the danger on two sides and discounting the girls as a threat, the man guarding them did not have time to react before blowpipe darts fired by Helen and Rose at his face and hands turned the tide of this fight. Our strength in numbers, the bravery and quick-witted actions of my family, and Michael's excellent choices in who and when to shoot were our advantage. Shocked, the guard yelped in pain and lurched above them, aiming to shoot them all as he twisted away from the darts, but hindered with his slow heart from the instant effects of the insulin in them, he raised his gun only to be pitched over and away from them by a well-aimed digitalis-laced arrow which lanced over my head and struck his right shoulder. He screamed as the barbed razor head embedded in his flesh. A blast from his gun sent up clods of earth and grass as it raked the ground before my family. Too far to reach him before he could reload, even though his face had paled and the actions of insulin and arrow conjoined to slow his reactions, my wife dropped Eve in the dirt and leapt back for the G19 lying in the cleared earth by the campfire where I'd thrown it, careful to ensure she was observing. Taking the weapon and cocking the slider rapidly, she span and levelled the muzzle on her attacker, firing a thunderous volley over her children that seemed to crack the very air in that sunlit clearing. The last round struck him in the belly as the first ejected shell hit the ground. He slumped, clutching the wound as blood plastered his hands. He was spared the agony of a slow death from those terrible wounds, the insulin rendering him unconscious before he slowly bled to death. But all had not gone our way. Despite the worlds of our assailants having closed in on them from all directions, my partner in this horrible dance had managed to sneak a thin blade from a scabbard on his belt, and in his final moments of consciousness had struck a burning hot blow to my upper thigh. I had felt nothing but what seemed to be a punch at the time. Now that the threat had been removed, waves of pain began to radiate from it. My groin felt wet and warm. A moment later, my wife stood over us. The dog snarled at her. Without hesitation, she struck it hard on the head with the pistol butt. It yelped in pain and limped away with its tail between its legs. As I rolled my victim off my limbs, I felt utterly weak, not only from the extreme fatigue from unarmed combat. This was a curious kind of drunken lightheadedness that accompanied the throbbing pain in my leg. I looked down, dumbfounded, as blood oozed from the wound in my upper thigh, spreading out from the thin tear in my trousers. My assailant had struck well, close to the passage of the femoral artery. Any more? I grimaced as my wife looked down. She tore off the dead man's shirt to create a compression bandage. No, what do we do? For the first time in many years, she looked worried for me. Pressure, lots of pressure, I gasped urgently, and then, you did well. I'm proud of you all. Tell the others to break camp. Have Rose watch the baby. The shots will attract more of them. We have to move. Without hesitation, she pressed hard on the wound, issuing urgent orders to the children as she did so. My son, having made the girls take cover, ran about gathering kit and stowing it, then checking the clearing for lost items. He showed no signs of distress at the events he had been a part of. I had no clarity of mind to congratulate him directly on a job well done. It seemed my fight was only just beginning. My leg felt numb now. Beads of sweat congregated on my forehead and lips. I closed my eyes as unconsciousness beckoned and my children's cries faded away to an echo in the distance, only to return as I fought the urge to let go. A tiny pair of lips brushed my cheek. "I love you, Daddy. Don't die." The sun, rising warm and clear in the east, filled the sky. Slowly, the gap in the tree canopy melted into a warm pool of white light. At its centre, a kite circled tightly, peering intently. Thinking hard through the blizzard of pain, I tried in vain to think what to do, but all I could come up with was panic and a sense of impending doom. I had never been stabbed before, nor felt this unwell, and I knew how serious it might be.